All right, great. So, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Hewlett. I'm one of the internal medicine residents here at Greenwich Hospital. And today I'm going to be talking about Lyme disease from a primary care perspective. Just as a little caveat, internal medicine residents are part of a 3-year program at Greenwich Hospital. And the focus is on a broad, all aspects of medicine, including infectious disease, where this lecture falls under. And if you have any questions throughout the talk, you can use the Q&A portion of the webinar. All right. So as for disclosures, I don't have any disclosures to inform the audience about. And as far as the topics today, we're going to, number one, understand how Lyme disease is spread. Number two, I want everyone to be able to recognize the symptoms of Lyme disease and know when you need to seek help. And I want everyone to be aware of how to prevent Lyme disease. So what is Lyme disease? I'm sure a lot of you out there are aware of the entity of Lyme disease, especially considering where we are right now. But it actually is the most common disease that's transmitted by a vector. And what this means is that the bacteria that causes Lyme disease is transmitted by another organism. And in this case, it is the tick, which we'll get into a little bit later. And each summer, about 30,000 new cases of Lyme disease are diagnosed, and annually, it's about 300,000 cases of Lyme disease. The Lyme disease itself is caused by a bacteria, which is called Borrelia burgdorferi, which again is passed through the bite of a tick. And Lyme disease causes symptoms that are similar to the flu. Muscle aches and rash as the early part of the disease. And then later on, it can progress to involve the joints, the heart, and the nervous system. And it's diagnosed by physical exam and laboratory testing. And usually the treatment involves antibiotics. So Lyme disease, interestingly, is named after Lyme, Connecticut, which you guys may be familiar with. It is up the coast a bit, but this is a letter to the State Department of Connecticut in 1976 that describes how Lyme disease was initially diagnosed. And it was because there were both adults and children in Old Lyme, Lyme, and East Haddam who had arthritis. And then they named the disease after the town, so it's Lyme disease. And it wasn't until a few years later that it was discovered that the Lyme disease itself is from the bacteria Borrelia burgdorferi. So this is pretty interesting that, you know, Lyme disease infects our area of the country, but it was actually discovered here. And it's thought to be related to changes in development and land use, where new communities are developed, disturbing the natural habitat, and that leads to you know, ticks landing more on humans and progression of the disease. So how does one get Lyme disease? Well, it's from this tick, specifically the black-legged tick, or the scientific name is Ixodes scapularis in the United States. There's other similar ticks found throughout the world, but this is the one that causes infection, especially in the Northeast. The ticks tend to bite humans in hidden areas such as the groin, armpits, and the scalp. And usually the ticks must be attached for at least 24 hours, more commonly 36 to 48 hours, in order to transmit the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So the most common form of the tick that spreads infection is actually the nymph, which is the smaller, more immature form of the tick. And these ticks are actually active in the summer months. Other ticks exist in the United States, but other ticks don't transmit Lyme disease. So there's a Lone Star tick, a dog tick, and these ones aren't associated with Lyme disease. And as some of you who have pets may know, pets can also get Lyme disease, but if your pet has Lyme disease, it can't directly transmit it to you unless you also get bitten by a tick that also bit your pet. This is just an illustration of the life cycle of Lyme disease, of the tick that spreads Lyme disease. So the ticks lay eggs that then hatch into larvae and develop into the nymph, which is the one that is associated with spreading Lyme disease. The nymph version of the tick bites an animal and humans, usually in the late spring and summer months, and then they progress into the adult phase, and then the adults lay eggs and perpetuate the cycle. At each development phase, the ticks need to have what's called a blood meal, which sounds a little gross, but they do need to feed on blood to progress, from larva to nymph, from nymph to adult, and then to perpetuate the life cycle by laying eggs. And the life cycle of ticks is about 2 years. Okay. And where in the country are people at risk for getting Lyme disease? This is a map taken from the CDC in 2017, but really it's these states here on the eastern seaboard that are particularly at risk for Lyme disease, including other states, Minnesota and Wisconsin, but endemic areas are the northeastern United States. Obviously, we're here in Connecticut, so it's something that we see quite often. In terms of tick bites, if you're bitten by a tick, you're not necessarily going to get Lyme disease from the tick, but the likelihood increases the longer that the tick is attached to your body. So this is guidance on how to remove a tick if it lands on you. The first step is to use tweezers to grasp the tick, usually at the head of the tick, as soon as possible. You would pull upward with even pressure and don't twist or jerk, because this can cause the pinchers to be left in the skin. So it's important that you get, the entirety of the tick when you grab it with the tweezers. And then after you remove the tick, it's important to cleanse the area with alcohol or soap. And what you would do then is actually save the tick. You'd have like a plastic, let's say plastic baggie, and put rubbing alcohol and the tick inside that, so it kills the tick, but it also allows the tick to be identified by the local health department. So it's important that the tick is identified so we know what disease risk the bite has posed. Okay. Let's see. And what do you do if you're bitten by a tick? Well, you follow the steps on the previous slide, but like I mentioned before, you bring the tick to your local health department. Here is the information for the Town of Greenwich Department of Health. It's at 101 Field Point Road. And I think their laboratory where you bring the specimen is on the first floor of the building. You would also, after the tick bite, monitor yourself for symptoms, which we'll go over on a later slide. And if you develop symptoms, including a rash, a fever, flu-like symptoms, you would then schedule an appointment with your healthcare provider. A caveat here, they actually recommend that you don't donate blood if you're undergoing treatment for Lyme disease. And what are the symptoms? We touched on these a little bit, but Lyme disease is kind of just broken up into early and late. So early symptoms usually occur from 3 to 30 days after a tick bite. You can see depictions here of the characteristic rash that comes with Lyme disease, which is called erythema migrans. The top picture here is a very early tick bite where you can still see some inflammation where the tick was most likely attached in the center here. And what it kind of creates is a targetoid or, target shaped lesion. So you see the middle spot and then the ring of, discoloration around. So this is actually an earlier bite, and this is a later phase of Lyme disease. Other symptoms can include fever, chills, headache, fatigue, and muscle aches. This is an interesting presentation when I was looking through journals in preparation for the talk of the rash of Lyme disease involving a child and involving the face. So you can see the same rash or similar rash presented on the previous slide, kind of around this child's eyes. And this is actually a case in Europe. So it's slightly different in terms of the exact bacteria and the exact tick that spread the disease, but it, still creates a very similar disease to what we know here as Lyme disease. Okay, and the late phase of Lyme disease usually occurs anywhere from weeks to months after the tick bite. And the symptoms of late Lyme disease are severe headaches. You can get neck stiffness and discomfort. You can get loss of muscle tone or droop on one or both sides of the face. And this picture here is describing that in a cartoon form. You can see this side of the face is drooping. And Lyme disease can actually cause both sides of the face to droop. This is because it affects the nerves that control the muscles of your face. Arthritis can develop usually in the large joints as depicted here, involving the knee. Heart palpitations, sometimes confusion, nerve pain, in addition to some issues with nerve and muscle strength, and dizziness. And some of these symptoms tend to last even after Lyme is treated. They can lag behind the treatment. So joint pain, sometimes like confusion or brain fog, and nerve pain can persist beyond the treatment. Okay. And how is Lyme disease diagnosed? So Lyme disease can actually be diagnosed just based on a patient's story of being bitten by a tick and also developing the characteristic rash that I showed on previous slides. But sometimes if the diagnosis is unclear, the provider might order blood tests, which is usually on a two-step mechanism. So both steps involve checking the blood for antibodies. If the first step is positive, then the assay proceeds to the second step. But if the first step is negative, then no further testing is needed. And after Lyme disease is diagnosed and treated, there's no test recommended by the CDC to confirm the cure of Lyme disease. As you guys may be familiar with in terms of the recent COVID pandemic, the antibodies tend to stick around after the disease has run its course. So if you have antibodies, it just indicates that you've had disease, but doesn't indicate the timing of the disease itself. Now, what is the treatment for Lyme disease? Lyme disease is treated with antibiotics, and the regimens tend to vary based on someone's personal medical history, pregnancy status, or allergies to antibiotics. The most classic antibiotic used to treat Lyme disease is doxycycline, but there's other alternative treatments, including amoxicillin, cefuroxime, azithromycin, or clarithromycin. These are all antibiotics. Usually, if the disease is caught early, the treatment is a 2-week course of antibiotics, but depending on the presentation and if there's certain later stage symptoms, like if the heart is involved or if there's neck stiffness or concern for neurologic involvement, the treatment might be intravenous antibiotics. Sometimes if you've had a tick attached and the thought that The thought is that it's high risk for Lyme disease. You might get a single dose of doxycycline to prevent development of symptoms. And the recovery from Lyme disease, the majority of people recover within a few weeks of treatment of Lyme disease. A small percentage, about 10 to 20%, have persistent symptoms after Lyme disease. Usually it's fatigue, muscle ache, sometimes confusion that persist more than 6 months after treatment for Lyme disease. And this is termed post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, or PTLDS. It's a little bit different from chronic Lyme disease, but it's an area of active research by the National Institutes of Health. And right now, there's not much guidance for treatment because so far we have studies that show not much benefit to continuing antibiotics beyond the initial diagnosis, but it's an ongoing area of research that is being funded and conducted through the NIH, NIAID, which is Allergy and Infectious Disease arm. Importantly, I think the most important take homes of the talk are how to prevent Lyme disease. So as I mentioned, Lyme disease comes from the bite of a tick, and the prevention of Lyme disease is really preventing tick bites. So you can actually buy clothing, wear clothing that's treated with permethrin, which helps reduce the incidence of a tick bite. And you can use EPA registered insect repellents, which include DEET, picaridin, etc. But just make sure to read the back of the insect repellent that you're buying to make sure it contains at least one of these agents. When you spend time outdoors, make sure that you or a family member checks for ticks. They tend to, like I mentioned before, be in areas that are hidden, like little crevices, like armpits. Ticks really like attaching there. A lot of times in clothing lines, like in elastic waistband of pants. And it's important to, as I mentioned, if there's a tick, remove it as soon as possible to prevent Lyme disease. Another way to prevent Lyme disease is shower as soon as possible after spending time outdoors. And additionally, if there's concern that ticks are on your clothes, you can treat your clothes in a dryer on high heat for 10 minutes to kill any ticks that might be attached to clothing. Just as a side note, ticks don't fly. They tend to attach on trees and branches nearby, a trail path. So if you, brush your clothing against a tree branch, it could be that a tick transfers onto your clothes. And these are some of my sources for the talk, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody may have.
If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Just move your cursor to the bottom. You'll see the Zoom bar come up and it'll say Q&A. Just click and type in your question, and the doctor can see your question and answer it for you.
So someone asked, once you have Lyme disease, are you then immune? So once you get infected with Lyme disease, your body does create an immune response against Lyme disease. But you can be infected again with Lyme disease, or it's possible that even if you have Lyme disease in the past that wasn't treated, that it can flare up in the future. Usually those type of cases cause arthritis, like I described on the previous slide. Okay. Someone asked about the vaccine, the Limerix vaccine, that they've been previously told that the test will always be positive for Lyme after receiving. So that ties into part of the talk that there's no real test of cure if you've had Lyme disease, and that's similar if you've gotten a vaccine, because your body will show signs of having fought off the bacteria or gotten a vaccine in the past. So the testing in that standpoint would usually appear to be positive, but it has to be interpreted in that way. So you know that you've been exposed before so that it would still be positive. Or if you've had the vaccine, it's the same type of thought process. And someone asked if I could share my slides, but I think the whole presentation is actually going to be posted. I don't know if Al can jump in on that one, but I think it's being recorded and it'll be posted online.
That's correct. It is being recorded. It will be posted on the Greenwich website.
Someone asks, what happens if you have DEET on your skin? So this is part of the bug spray that a lot of companies, they put this ingredient in the bug spray to deter, ticks. Unless you have an allergy, it's okay to apply it as long as it's, through a bug spray that's sold commercially. But just make sure if you have allergies to DEET that you don't use some of these products. Someone asked, are deer to blame for these ticks? Yes and no. So deer are they can be part of the tick's life cycle. They actually used to call the black-legged tick the deer tick. And it's because part of the tick's life cycle involves deer because it can be part of the blood meal for the tick. So it kind of goes into that discussion about when forests were moved so that housing developments can take place. It produces a migration of the ticks and the wildlife like deer, and leads to more infection of humans. So they do have some part to play in the progression of Lyme disease. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's listened. I think raising awareness of Lyme disease is really important, especially given that it's June right now, and it's prime season for tick bites and potential development of Lyme disease. But if you, of course, have any questions or concerns, just want to urge you guys to see your primary care provider to ask those questions. And maybe now that you have a little bit more background information, that you'll be more aware of what to look out for. Great. All right. I think the questions have slowed down. I don't know if anyone has any last minute questions. I'm happy to answer, but otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in.
Okay, then some people are leaving now, so I guess stop the recording.
Great.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everyone.